Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking about maximising ESOS action plans for net zero. I'm going to be joined today by a number of colleagues from JRP, including Elinor Kershaw, who some of you have probably met on previous webinars, Joe Horn, who's our operations director, and also Owen Jones, who's a very experienced ESOS lead assessor and chartered engineer. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Okay, so just going to give you a little bit of background and context for those of you who don't know JRP. Hopefully most of you do, but we're not new kids on the block. We've been around for 25 years now. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary in a few days' time and throughout next year. We are considered to be the UK's leading independent energy net zero and outsourcing specialists. And I'd say our key differentiators are that we are very experienced across all sectors. We take a practical and pragmatic approach to finding the appropriate solutions and strategies for our clients. We're supplier and technology agnostic, which I think is particularly important because we're not out there trying to promote anyone's products or products or energy or anything else. And we also walk the walk. We don't just talk the talk. So we're a JRP or a B Corp certified organisation, and we will be net zero by 2030. And you can see there through all the various logos, the type of companies that we work with. But more recently, we've also done something approaching 100 ESOS audits under phase 3. So that probably totals about 500 we've done over the last since 2015-16 when ESOS was first introduced, so vastly experienced. Next slide, please. And here's an overview of our core services, which hopefully some of you are familiar with and will work with us in different areas. Today we're going to be talking about some of these, particularly around data, which I'll touch upon, and then Eleanor will build upon later on, and of course energy management, which is where we started. And net zero and climate resilience, which is really what we're talking about today. Asset management, we'll talk about another day, but it's primarily start off with facilities management outsourcing, and then it's centered around individual projects, etc., about outsourcing and insourcing. Project implementation has always been something we've assisted clients with, but of course with the ESOS Action Plan, for those of you that are planning on implementing technical projects, again, this is an area in which we can certainly help. And of course, ESG has become what sustainability was always, and in some quarters is called sustainability now. So ESG sustainability is one and the same in my view. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, I'm going to start off talking about energy efficiency as a core component of net zero, which will be myself, followed by Eleanor, who will talk about energy data as part of a net zero baseline. And then Owen will be talking about setting a realistic ESOS action plan. And the action plans, as I'm sure some of you may have already found, is not as simple as you might think, or at least it shouldn't be. And then Joe will talk about effective project management. And then we'll come back to me, unfortunately for you, to talk about examples of delivered opportunities. And then, provided there's time, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. For those questions that we're not able to answer, then we'll email all participants with the answers to those questions that have been raised. There will also be a poll towards the end of today's session, so if you please participate in that, would be great. It's only a few quick, easy questions, but it helps us to get feedback on this one, and also helps us to focus on what our future webinars should be. So next slide, please. So I'll quickly talk to you over the next 5 or 10 minutes about energy efficiency as a core component of net zero. Next slide, please. So energy efficiency affects all scopes of GHG emissions. And if you think about it, if we think about our own emissions, most organisations will initially at least focus on scope 1, scope 2, i.e. their own direct emissions, which are emitting from their own site's activities. so gas, electricity, LPG, etc., on their own sites. However, it's clearly illustrated by this chart here. Typically, the bulk of your emissions, of any organisation's emissions in any sector, arise from scope 3. And within scope 3, the biggest percentage of scope 3 emissions arise from purchased goods and services, i.e. category 1. Now, category 1 is obviously purchased goods and services, which emanate from your supply chain or your suppliers. Their scope 1, scope 2 is part of your scope 3. So energy efficiency, if they're good at their own energy efficiency on their sites, that will impact your scope 3 emissions, which is the whole point of putting up this slide here. So energy efficiency does affect all scopes. Next slide, please. So it really doesn't matter what your working environment is, whether it's a busy office, a hospital, or a manufacturing centre. It doesn't really matter, or what sector you're in either. Energy efficiency can be impacted by us as individuals and us collectively, and at an organisational level. So there is always something that we can do. And even those businesses that say have ISO 50001 energy management system in place should always be looking to continually improve, because trust me, we've done audits of various organisations that have ISO 50001 EMS systems in place, and we've identified lots of areas for improvement. So you can't sit on your laurels. There is plenty of opportunity even in those organisations. Next slide, please. So before we would even dream of recommending looking at your own supply chain, for instance, and asking them to improve their scope 1, scope 2 to help reduce your scope 3 emissions, get your own house in order would be my advice. And that's quite simply by looking at the obvious, i.e. your key bits of kit, your utility plant, whether it's chiller plant, air compressors, boilers, pumps and motors. And it's easy for us to say glibly, oh, look at your plant, make them more efficient. It's about having a holistic approach to energy management. So if you take pumps and motors as an example, which is one I like to cite, or even compressed air, quite often when we ask the question of how do you currently manage your compressed air to ensure it's as efficient as it can be, most people will proudly turn around and say, oh, we do an air leak survey once a year. But of course that then begs the question, well, okay, so let's say you have your air leak survey, you fix all your leaks. What happens the day after when an air leak springs up? No one's noticed it. There's no way of monitoring it. Therefore, no one fixes it for 364 days until your next air leak survey. So it's about having a policy, having energy awareness training in place, so people on the shop floor recognise an air leak and it doesn't just become part of the white noise. And you have a maintenance strategy in place, but hopefully with an SLA and a KPI that says, if an air leak is reported, it must be fixed within shift, within 24 hours. And similarly with motors, you get a failing motor, what's your policy around it? Do you have a motor replacement policy? So it's those sorts of things that will really help to drive energy efficiency across the organisation. Next slide, please. And again, looking at buildings, particularly office buildings, its controls is often, and behaviour change are two of the big opportunities. So there's often a fit and forget mindset with regards to BMS systems, for instance, where they're put in and they're forgotten about, assuming that they're doing their job. But of course, they can only do their job, one, if they're managed, and secondly, if they're allowed to do their job. So in other words, if people working in these office buildings aren't overriding controls, or are leaving things on which aren't controlled by the BMS system. So for instance, not pulling down blinds or pulling them up, so allowing natural daylight, leaving lights on, leaving computer monitors on. And in some cases, we found that even with the BMS system in place, because it's not being used properly, that you've got air conditioning on and heating on at the same time, which is absolutely crazy from an energy perspective, and also clearly from an environmental perspective too, and a cost perspective. Next slide, please. But, and I've banged this drum numerous times at various presentations and webinars such as this, but data is for me the start and the end point. If what data does, it gives you visibility, if you like, of what's going on from an energy perspective within your own organization. At a site level, it can measure the energy intensity of processes, products, or indeed buildings. It can identify hotspots. It can tell you very quickly through regression analysis how well energy is being controlled. And it measures the performance of implemented projects, which helps the conversation with the FD next time you go with cap in hand asking for money for another project. They will want to know how well the previous project they've invested money in has performed. So unless you have good quality data, you're not going to be able to tell them that, and it will make getting money for your next project a lot more challenging, shall we say. And it also does simple things like helps you to validate utility bills, make sure you're paying for the right amount of energy that you've actually used, not what you're being told you've used. And where we would start is to look at existing MM&T systems. So in other words, metered infrastructure and whatever platform you're using to collate that data, and to make sure it's working effectively for you. We're not out there to sell meters or MMT systems. We're there to make it work for you. So understanding what it is you want that system to deliver to you, what information, in what format, and what frequency, and to which stakeholders, and make sure that that is what that system's going to deliver. That's what we do. And always start with the most critical or high energy using plant equipment, because that's the one that's using the most energy, quite clearly. And avoid just collecting data for the sake of it and then doing nothing with it. You know, data lakes is quite a common occurrence where, you know, someone's bought into 1,000 meters and a fancy front end system, but no one actually does anything effective, and all you end up with is a huge data lake. Because the most important thing to do is then to interpret and analyze that data and report the useful information to your key stakeholders. And then once you've got that information, take the appropriate action. Next slide, please. So as I said, understanding what it is you want your data to tell you is critical into understanding what system you need to enable to deliver that and what support you need to enable you to do that. And quite clearly what it does at an organizational level is underpin your strategies and your net zero roadmaps, enables benchmarking across sites or across an organization. Clearly it helps you to calculate your carbon footprint and identify your sources of emissions. And pardon me, and also enables you to identify your biggest emitters within your supply chain, which then subsequently helps you to engage those biggest emitters and help them on their own journey to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, which in turn will reduce your scope 3. It also informs target setting, it validates performance, and it's absolutely essential for carbon and ESG reporting, which is becoming more and more onerous and demanding. Next slide, please. So what we found is doing all the audits that we've done, particularly around ESOS, but also general energy audits and net zero gap analysis, is data seems to be a real challenge for a lot of organisations. I mean, despite with ESOS, this being the 3rd phase now, data is still the biggest challenge for many organisations. And what we did with all of those clients that we work with around ESOS, we did a gap analysis to understand, you know, what needed to be addressed to get their data in a better position for phase 4 and indeed for future reporting under other frameworks as well. So if that's an area, if that's something that's of interest, we can certainly help you to identify those gaps and then come up with an appropriate solution that'll help you moving forward. Next slide, please. And another one I've banged on about goodness knows how many times, but behaviour change really is the untapped gold mine, and data will help identify that, absolutely for sure. But I think almost universally, with every single client we've worked with, behaviour change has been identified as a key opportunity, irrespective of organisation. It really is a relatively low cost and truly sustainable opportunity to help reduce emissions, help reduce energy consumption, help reduce costs. Because once you've changed behaviours within an organisation, and you really do have to change the DNA and the culture of that organisation, it really is a sustainable solution. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to hand over to Elinor.
Thank you, George. Next slide, please. So I'm going to bring us back in a more sort of practical and straightforward sense of how does ESOS fit into net zero in practice. So net zero emissions objectives, whether that's sort of 2050 targets, Paris Climate Agreement, they're all relating to greenhouse gas emissions that arise in your operations and value chain. And subsequently, substantially, that is linked to burning of fossil fuels. A great deal of it is. If you're already looking at your greenhouse gas footprint for your organisation, you'll probably have noticed that there is a very big overlap between your ESOS consumption data and the emissions inventory data for scopes 1 and 2. If you're just starting out and you haven't looked at your footprint at all yet, or you're just considering your net zero journey, then this data is a really good place to start. It's going to give you a step on the ladder for certain. But at its simplest, anything burned or emitted on your site or from your fleet is in scope 1. The energy you use as electricity or steam that's generated elsewhere is in scope 2. And your grey fleet is in business travel in scope 3. Energy consumption data converts really readily to greenhouse gases using standard emissions factors that are published annually by DEFRA, and that's by fuel type. So all the fuels that are used for heating, for processes, for any operational equipment like welding should be included. So there might be a few things that need to be included on a net zero basis that you wouldn't have included in ESOS, but the particularly small things that might have been excluded in your sort of de minimis. But you will still have a good starting point. Next slide, please. So putting that into the net zero context, here's a lovely diagram from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So your ESOS data is going to allow you to substantially complete your scope 1 and 2 inventory. Some additional data that you might need if you have heat pumps or refrigeration, because F gases are in scope 1. So that's particularly strong greenhouse gases. There's some of these sort of HFCs, PFCs that they're not included in ESOS, but they can be an important part of your net zero. Also, if you have leased premises where you don't pay separately for your heat and power, that's unlikely to have been in your ESOS, but would be in your net zero, would come in scope 2. We call it purchased heat. Another thing is that grey fleet will typically only be a part of your total business travel, so there'll be additional data needed on flights, public transport, taxis might be needed. If that's something you think could be significant for you, we have a travel calculator that can help with that, so do get in touch if that's something that you've been struggling with on a data front that might benefit you. The same energy consumption data for your scope 1 and 2 also allows calculation of scope 3, category 3, shown there with the sort of thought cloud bubble. That's upstream emissions from fuel and energy related activities, also sometimes called well to tank. And these are the emissions associated with extraction, processing, distribution of fuels and energy, as well as upstream losses in transmission distribution, particularly for electricity. So to put it simply, it's all the fuel and energy that's used in the wider system before that fuel or energy, as electricity or steam, arrives with you and you start to use it. As George already mentioned at the start, beyond these categories with direct links to your energy, the scope 1 and 2 of your suppliers and the broader supply chain beyond them will be reflected in your scope 3, purchase goods and services. So asking your key suppliers about their emissions reduction plans could include talking about their ESOS action plans. And once we start seeing these published, it might be something that becomes part of your procurement due diligence, is looking up for a particular key supplier. What have they published in their ESOS action plan if ESOS applies to them? Next slide, please. You might be thinking, oh, I buy renewable energy. Do I need to worry about this? But you might be getting electricity from renewable sources or certified green gas from anaerobic digestion or other methane capture. But unless you've got a private wire or private supply from the renewable source, you still have to calculate all your emissions based on the grid average as a minimum. That's known as location based. And if you have to do any kind of mandatory reporting, that part of it has to be reported. You can then optionally report alongside it an adjusted figure for the certified renewable energy, which is known as market-based. but this has to be backed by REGO for electricity or RGGO for gas. And that ensures essentially that the unit of electricity or gas that's used by you is linked to an equivalent renewably sourced unit entering the grid, and make sure that it's only sold once. Because if just being on something that's called a green tariff, but without having it be REGO backed, means nothing. To be honest, that unit of energy renewable could have been sold 25 times over. It's not a bad thing. You are paying into the improvement of the grid, but you don't get to report any of that as good work that you're doing in terms of numerical emissions data. Next slide, please. So ESOS data isn't just useful in establishing your footprint. The opportunities and action plans also give you a really good start for developing your emissions reduction trajectory for scopes 1 and 2. So if you think about all of the opportunities that you've had in your summaries, you can put a date to each of those and when you're going to complete those recommendations, plus any other planned activities such as major plant upgrades. And then you can map those as planned emissions reductions over time. In this example from a client with a lot of space heating requirements, we identified a number of operational and behaviour change opportunities to reduce their energy consumption using their existing systems in the short and medium term. They're going up to 2030. And then from 2030, they're planning that all of their end-of-life equipment, when that needs to be replaced, will be replaced with a net zero, well, with a zero direct emissions option. Essentially, they're moving away from gas-fired heating for anything that is end of life after 2030. And we compared that to an ideal decarbonisation pathway shown there in blue, which we've taken from Future Energy Scenarios Pathway to Net Zero report. So this is in aligning it with a national trajectory for moving off natural gas to support a net zero transition. So a lot of work has gone into working out in order to allow us to complete our net zero objectives as a country. This is what the downward trajectory in scope 1 gas consumption needs to look like. So we use that for this company as the best comparison. And you can see in this case that partial replacement of gas using equipment by 2035 puts them on the right trajectory, but a longer term plan is needed to ensure the remainder keeps pace over the rest of time to 2050. Next slide, please. The same approach can be taken for reducing electricity use in scope 2, but as more demand for energy moves from gas and other burn fuels to electricity, for example through heat pumps, the overall demand will increase. And this means that we're dependent on grid decarbonisation as well as reduction in demand at site level wherever possible. And this slide shows two scenarios, again from that Future Energy Scenarios report. On the left is a plausible best case scenario with increased renewables that has a zero emissions grid by 2035. So for individual organisations, this would mean that their scope 2 emissions would be at or close to zero emissions from this point onwards. But on the right is an alternative scenario where progress is made but not really fast enough or far enough. And if renewable energy is going into the grid slower to develop, we need to do more to stringently manage site demand to close that gap. In any case, reducing your site demand through efficiencies, smart working, other opportunities will contribute to your decarbonisation journey, as well as supporting the national decarbonisation through demand management. And realistically, to support all these kinds of improvements at grid level, we're going to see energy prices go up. So the fewer kilowatt hours that you're using, that's going to be better for your balance sheet. Next slide, please. Now I'll hand you on to Owen to talk about the action plans in a bit more detail.
Hello. Hi. Yes. So I'm going to talk about ESOS action plans now. So can you give me the next slide, please? So sort of the ESOS timeline. At the moment, we're sitting after the original compliance deadline for the ESOS action plans, which was the 5th of December. So we're a few days past that now, but that's now been extended to the 5th of March next year. But that's only, well, that's less than 3 months away now, with Christmas sitting in the middle of that as well. Then after that, there is you'll have to do an annual update of that plan on the 5th of December next year, 2025, and then a further update on the 5th of December 2026. And then we're back from the 31st of December 2026. We're actually moving into ESOS phase 4 compliance period then. So next slide, please. So what do you have to include in your action plan? So you have to include what you intend to do to reduce your energy consumption, when you intend to do it, how the opportunity or the measures that you're doing, where they came from, so where the recommendations came from, were they from an ESOS audit, were they from an alternative compliance route like ISO 50001, or were they from some other source? What energy savings you expect to achieve over the 4-year period covered by the action plan. So this is not, so it's not an annual saving from the opportunity or the measure you're implementing, but it's the energy that's going to be saved within the period of 5th of December 2023 to 5th of December 2027. So that 4-year period. So if you implement a project part the way through that period, then it would be the energy that's saved from the date of implementation through to the 5th of December 2027. And then the other important thing you need to include is how you've estimated those savings. And one of the big ones as well is all of this needs to be signed off by a director to say that they've agreed to this. Okay, next slide, please. So what's driving this? Why do you need to do this? So you're not actually compelled to submit or complete any energy saving measures whatsoever in ESOS. There's no requirement to do that. There are no fines for not achieving your action plan. So if you put in an action plan, put in 50 opportunities you say you're going to do and you don't do them, there is no fine for not achieving that. But what does happen is your action plan will be published by the Environment Agency, and then potentially you'll be measured by stakeholders, customers, etc., on how you achieve that action plan or not. Okay, next slide, please. So, I think we've yeah, thank you. So why do an action plan? So other than the reputational potential risk, what are the other benefits to you? So it can enhance your environmental credibility. It can result in notable reputational rewards and also significant financial benefits as well. So although there's a reputational issue here, this also, you're getting the best out of the ESOS, what you've done for ESOS. So you've gone to through the process of identifying measures. If you can use the action plan to help push those measures through to completion, then you will then receive the benefits of reduced energy consumption, reduced cost, reduced carbon emissions, and increased reputation. So if you just do lip service to the action plan, potentially that may have expose your organization to scrutiny from stakeholders and customers, investors, might cause longer-term reputational impacts, and you're missing the opportunities that have been identified within the ESOS process. So next slide, please. So what are your basic options for action plans? Essentially, there's 4 options that you can do. You can submit a no action to the Environment Agency to say you're not going to do any actions within the 4-year period. And that might be suitable for some organizations that either have very few opportunities or no real opportunities. That's highly unlikely, really. Or there may be other reasons why you'd want to do that. But it will potentially look bad on your organization that you're not taking environmentally, the environment, net zero and energy efficiency seriously. Second option is looking at a simple plan. Make sure you're just choosing projects that are easy to achieve. So simple, low cost projects. Again, that could be suitable for some organizations, but for other organizations, it might look actually as you're not being very ambitious and you're not committed to energy reduction and net zero and carbon reduction. Third option is looking at a challenging, complex plan where you've got complex projects, high cost, higher risk projects within the plan. But the danger of doing that is that you then do not achieve those projects over the 4-year life cycle of the ESOS reporting period for the action plans. And then that again could look detrimental to your organization because you've promised a lot up front and then you've just not achieved it. So the fourth option, which is sort of a middle ground, is setting a more simple action plan initially for the 5th of March deadline, because it's not far away, of projects you're fairly confident you can achieve and that you've got the resources in-house to do. And then also set an internal plan, which has some of the more complex, difficult projects that may need a bit longer to spec out and get approval from your director. And then progress both plans. And then when you come to do the annual updates in 5th of December 2025 and 5th of December 2026, once you've got more confidence over those more complex projects, you can then include those in your action plan at that point, rather than the first action plan, which is due fairly shortly. Okay, next slide, please. So we've created a decision tree, which hopefully would help you go through and understand more the issues around how you set out your action plan and what projects to include and what projects not to include. Haven't got time to go through all that now, but there is going to be a link sent out to that decision tree, which you can download and go through yourselves at a later date. Next slide, please. So what should you look for when you're looking to identify what you want to do in your action plan? So you need to understand how you're going to fund them. So you're going to use OPEX, operational money, or you're going to use capital investment money. What investment is needed, how much money is needed, and how much time is needed as well from internal resources, etc., to manage those projects. Currently, what stage is the project at? Is it just an idea? Has some feasibility study been done? Have you done an investment grade audit on it? Have you got investment grade or has a CapEx? You might find CapEx approval has been granted, or it might actually even be completed. And these are some of the best ones to include in your action plan, because anything that's been completed and implemented since the 5th of December 2023 can be included in your action plan. So you might find you've got a number of projects that have been completed in the last year that you can put in your action plan and you know you've done them. So that's the ideal solution, really. That's the ideal situation. But you may want to include others as well that are further out. What resources are needed? Are you going to need some external help with the projects? Do you have the internal knowledge and the internal time and resource to actually do the projects you're looking to include in your action plan? Do you know what the likely payback of the plan is, of the measure you're looking at doing? Have you done things like a life cycle cost analysis on it to firm up what the financial benefits of that project are? What other factors feed into the projects you want to choose? Is it going to feed into your net zero strategy? Is it going to feed into sustainability? Are there health and safety implications around the project that might improve health and safety, or business continuity? Are you replacing older equipment that may be unreliable? Are there other things that you can use to justify that project other than just the energy savings? Again, do you have the internal resources to do the actual project management required for that project? And then the big one really is, what evidence is the director going to need to sign these projects off? Because they're going to need to agree initially for the first initial plan by the 5th of March 2025. They're going to have to sign off and agree that those projects are part of that plan. So they may, for certain projects, want CapEx approval done before that. Have you got time to do that by the beginning of March? Okay, next slide, please. So when you're doing an action plan, you need to maintain, as with the main ESOS assessment, you need to maintain an evidence pack around your action plan to make sure that if you get audited by the Environment Agency, you've got the evidence to back up what you've put into the submission system. So this needs to include details of the measures and where they came from. Did they come from ESOS audits? Did they come from another compliance route, or is there some other way that they were identified, maybe through an internal suggestion scheme or something like that? So there may be other methods that these projects have been identified through, and that needs to be recorded. As part of the plan, you need to submit the year and month you initially predict to the action to be completed. You should also include evidence in your evidence pack of when the measure was actually implemented, so you can prove when it was implemented. One of the big things that the Environment Agency in the guidance are quite clear on is there needs to be a lot of evidence around the methods used to calculate savings, and the reasons why those particular methods were used. So that might be through an ESOS audit, but there might be other ways that you've calculated the energy savings. And again, the energy savings need to be over the period of the 4 years of the action plan from that achieved in that period, from the 5th of December 2023 to the 5th of December 2027. So it's not just an annual, we're going to save this many kilowatt hours a year. It's how many kilowatt hours are going to be saved over that period. The other thing that you can include with your action plan is savings associated with high level targets. So for instance, you might have a climate change agreement, or you might be within the UK emissions trading scheme, or there may be other targets around potentially net zero that that your organization is committed to, and that can be used and put into the action plan as a potential saving, albeit based on a commitment rather than actual having a specific measure in place to make those savings. What you've got to be careful around with that is, as if you're going to include those in the action plan, in the evidence pack, you've got to include evidence around the baseline you're using for those savings. And then you've also got to include within the evidence pack whether the savings are in addition to the measures identified in the action plan, or whether the measures in the action plan are incorporated within those savings that you're declaring as part of the target that you've set the organization. The other thing that would need to be in the evidence pack is any changes in the group structure during the 4-year period. So if a company within an organization leaves the organization during the action plan period, there's a number of options of what can happen. They can leave the organization but still comply with the original organization, or they can leave and they go to a new organization that has completed ESOS. Then they can agree to comply with the action plan with the new organization, or alternatively they can do the action plan on their own. So there's a number of different options, but all that needs to be recorded. Any changes in the organization during that 4-year period need to be kept in the evidence pack, and how the entities that are changing ownership are complying with the action plan also needs to be recorded. And then the last one that needs to be in the action plan is probably one of the most important ones, is evidence that the director has signed off the original action plan and the progress updates on the 5th of December 2026 and the 5th of December 2025. Okay, next slide, please. So what are the next steps? So yes, you want to set your action plan, decide what you want to include and what you don't want to include, whether you want to go for a simple action plan, whether you want to go for a simple action plan that you're submitting initially with an internal, more complex, more difficult action plan, more stretching internal action plan. Then you need to look at getting the stakeholder sign off for that. So that's the director needs to sign it off, but you also need to get sign off of other stakeholders within the organization to make sure that they're on board with trying to achieve those measures. You need to complete your submission online, which needs to be done by the 5th of March. And then you need to work to implement those measures. You need to review progress on the opportunities you've identified in your plans. I would suggest that you need to review them at least on a quarterly basis, if not more often than that. And then once every 12 months, you will need to then submit an update to your plan to the Environment Agency. And then the final one is, again, it seems a long time away, 31st of December 2026, but it'll come around pretty quickly. That's when ESOS Phase 4 compliance period starts. But you can start doing audits now that will count towards that compliance period. So you also want to start thinking about where and when and what you want to audit, and then potentially that will identify new measures that you can either introduce into your action plan at a later date or use in the following phase action plan. And the other thing to mention about the Phase 4 ESOS is there are going to be some changes. We haven't got the full details from the Environment Agency yet, but it's likely that net zero and carbon reduction will feature much more heavily within the ESOS Phase 4 process. Right, next slide, please. So just a quick summary on the action plans. You want to try and include realistic deliverable measures. Certainly in the plan that you're submitting to the Environment Agency, you may want to do some more complex, difficult opportunities internally, progress those internally, and then put them into the action plan at a review stage. You need to make sure you're getting high level buy-in from the directors and that they are going to sign off what you're putting forward in the action plan. You want to put strong business cases together, especially for where a higher level of capital investments required, to make sure the directors are happy to sign off the plan. Fairly obvious, you want to prioritize stuff that's going to give you the best benefit for the shortest time and the least investment, which is sort of obvious, but you know, it's something you need to think about when you're looking at the measures that you're trying to implement. What resources and funding are going to be required to do these projects? Have you got those internally? If you haven't got those internally, can you source those externally? Is there third-party funding potentially for some projects, for things like projects like putting solar photovoltaics on buildings? You can look at third-party funding where you buy the electricity off somebody else and they actually pay for the installation. So you don't need the capital available to do that sort of thing. Make sure you're engaging with all the key stakeholders. So not just necessarily the director who's got to sign it off, but other people within the business who have an impact on whether the measures you're putting into your plan are actually going to be successful or not. So making sure you're engaging with the different departments, etc., within your organization to do that. Think about and try and communicate within the organization what is the cost of not doing these measures, because sometimes that sort of gets lost, that actually you're looking at savings, but if you don't do it, utility prices are actually increasing potentially over a period of time. So over a period of time, the cost of not doing the measures can actually be significantly more than the annual payback that you would calculate from a simple payback calculation. Again, sort of mixing in with what Elinor was saying earlier on, looking at measures that complement your decarbonisation strategy and net zero goals, making sure that you're choosing measures that are complementary to that, and also that align with your company's vision and mission statements. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's all from me. I'd like to hand over to my colleague Joe, who's going to be talking about effective project management. Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. I'll just literally got a couple of minutes because I think George wants to do a bit on his side of things as well. So next slide, please. Basically, Project Activator is a web-based tool that we've developed to log opportunities and track progress and effectiveness of live projects. It's a great tool and helps you keep all your information in one place, so all your energy saving opportunities can be held together. And the system sort of lets you log the kilowatt hour savings that you've identified, and it automatically calculates your scope 1 and scope 2 tons of CO2. So it helps you not only with your ESOS plans, but it also helps you with your net zero journey. The CO2 lets you sort of figure out what projects are going to be the best ones to do to sort of help you get to that net zero position in your timescales. It's great in terms of the features that we're very flexible, and it sort of meets your needs in terms of looking at stakeholders or risk or engaging, identifying project costs. And it helps you sort of pull everything together and have it all in one place. So that's the sort of key features of it. If you want to move to the next slide, please. So this is just a sort of overview of the sort of type of information that's going to be in there in terms of kilowatt hour savings, project costs, tons of CO2, what the projects are, and how you can sort of develop them into sort of opportunities, from opportunities into actual projects. Next slide, please. So the project side of it looks at from all the way through the project life cycle, all the way from development, all the way through to delivering the project and then actually validating the project. So look at whether the benefits of the project have actually been realised in terms of your tons of CO2 reductions or your kilowatt hour reductions, whether it was done on cost, within your budget. And so you can look at back across the project and sort of get a really good idea of how effective that project was. Next slide, please. So typical reports that come out of can be used to sort of look at supporting other business reporting. We can highlight projects that are from different sites or different regions and look at the tons of CO2 savings that you've had across your opportunity pipeline, what's still in there and what you've done and what you've achieved and what you can still do. So then you can pick and choose the projects that you want to sort of include in your ESOS plans or your net zero plans. And it sort of keeps it all in one place and gives you the opportunity to sort of present that to wider stakeholders within your business. And it helps you identify the sort of like low-hanging fruit. So the ones that like Owen's just mentioned about, the ones that can give you the best benefit for the cheapest cost, maximise your sort of kilowatt hour savings or your tons of CO2 reductions, and give you the sort of the shortest payback period. And you can use the system to look at those and identify which projects are going to be the best ones to include in your plans from that perspective. The next slide, please. Just more examples of how you can sort of use the reports to highlight the investments and potential savings that you've got in your ESOS from your ESOS plans. But the good thing about this system is that it's not just ESOS opportunities that you can put in there. You can identify anything across your sites from ISO 50000 or just opportunities that people within the working environment identify. You can log these in here and then work them up into sort of really good, strong projects that will deliver you kilowatt hour savings and sort of support your energy ESOS reductions and net zero. So that's a really sort of really very quick overview of the project activator that we've developed. Next slide, please. So the key outputs, it allows the users to sort of look at the opportunity information, keep it all in one place. So it's really good for the ESOS Action Plan evidence, and can track projects, and it gives you the opportunity to identify projects that will be useful to you for your ESOS plans or your net zero journey. And it provides confirmation of energy savings in tons of CO2, kilowatt hours and pounds for any ongoing reporting across the business. So I'll just quickly hand you over to George now, because we've only got a few minutes left to do some examples of delivered opportunities.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, and there's a couple of large organisations already using Project Activator, Vodafone and Severn Trent Water, and others are beginning to adopt it. So I think what's particularly useful is where you get your annual carbon report and it shows that you're behind the curve in terms of where you want to get to, it's a great way of using a tool like this, where you can just identify the projects that are going to deliver that and close that gap in terms of CO2 emissions. So it's a real benefit, I think, going forward. I'm just going to run through very quickly, because we're running short of time, a couple of examples of delivered opportunities. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about University of Oxford, a very well-known pizza manufacturer. It won't take a genius to work that one out. Some work we've done with Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Council, and improved data management. If any of you were on the webinar a couple of weeks ago around data management, you'll have seen Mike talking about that. Next slide, please. So yeah, energy audits and carbon management plan. We did this at the University of Oxford. Obviously, as you can imagine, a university campus it's got lots of buildings. It's quite complex. It doesn't lend itself to energy efficiency. And they were obviously aiming to reduce their emissions by 21,500 tonnes a year. What we did was to develop a 5-year carbon management plan for them, having done a full audit of the campus. And we identified gaps and where they needed to improve. So we conducted detailed energy audits and identified specific savings and energy efficiency opportunities. And the key to that was, as I mentioned earlier on, an assessment and optimization of their building energy management system. Next slide, please. And you can see the savings that were achieved were over £250,000 a year, which reduced their total cost by 32%, and gave them a payback through the implementation cost of 2.3 years. So acceptable, I'd say, these days for 99% of organisations, and help reduce their carbon over time by 15,000 tonnes, which is, it's pretty good. It's 70% of the university's 5-year target. You're not going to achieve everything in one go, so there'll be other things that can be done. Next slide, please. A very well-known pizza manufacturer wanted to look at renewables and the potential for those. So we did an audit of 2 of their manufacturing facilities where they make the dough, basically, and oversaw, helped them to develop and implement a project to install solar PV on their roofs. Next slide, please. So what that resulted in was an annual saving of about £300,000 a year, which is really good. The project cost £1.6 million, but as with solar, as any of you have had any experience of it, the payback period has come down from, used to be 7 to 10 years. And in this particular case, it's come down to about 5 years, which is really good. In this particular instance, the client decided to capitalise the project themselves, but we have helped other clients with solar and other types of technical projects to look at other mechanisms for delivery, such as asset finance or indeed power purchase agreements. So that negates the need for the clients to put up any capital, and the project is delivered. It's basically de-risked, if you like, so it mitigates any risks, puts that back on the supplier through a performance agreement, and, as I say, negates the need for any capital investment, and gives you a guarantee around performance. So there are more ways to do these projects than merely having to use your own capital, which is often in competition with production in any case and difficult to access. Next slide, please. Yeah, we've done quite a lot of work with this council. We don't work a lot with local authorities. We have worked with about 60% of the UK's universities and a number of local authorities and NHS trusts as well. But we did quite a lot of work with them. We did an ISO 50001, got them there. We did decarbonisation energy efficiency audits across their estate. Pardon me. So, and we've done some behaviour change with them as well. Next slide, please. So we identified cost savings of about £125,000 a year, which if they applied those opportunities and implemented them across the sites, a payback of less than 9 months, which is quite incredible. And of course, local authorities typically are, capital isn't often readily available for them, and as we know, they're short funded. So to identify and help them implement over time those opportunities will be a great benefit to Merthyr. So we look forward to continuing to work with them. Next slide, please. And this was, of course, making a point about data management. Anyone that saw this webinar or attended the EMIX presentation a couple of weeks ago would have heard from Mike directly himself. And what he said was, well, we weren't out there, we weren't tree huggers, we weren't out there to be the best in construction. We just wanted to do the right things within our budget restrictions. And that's exactly what they did. So it was really looking at data across their 15 commercial buildings, which they manage and constructed in some cases. So they want to get a better handle on their data across all three scopes. Next slide, please. So yeah, I mean, quite incredibly, at one site, we managed to, through data analysis, getting better quality data, looked at achieving a 61% reduction in gas consumption. That's quite incredible. The actual energy data reported energy use reduced by 86% at one property, which is absolutely astonishing. So when people talk about data, it sounds a very dry subject, but it is so critical for identifying these opportunities and then validating the performance of any intervention or technical projects that you implement. So it just really is a good example of how powerful data can be. Next slide, please. So Beth's going to, in a minute or two, put up some a poll with a number of questions. So if as many of you can participate in that, that would be great. But how can we support you? Well, we can support you in any way you want us to. We're non-prescriptive in how we work, as many people will testify, but we can support you in helping to understand the action plan that you should be putting together that's appropriate for your organisation. And we can also help you to implement any technical projects or behaviour change projects that you think are going to deliver the value that they should deliver for you. So we can help you in whatever way you want. We can do that through a framework agreement, or we can do that through a site support arrangement where it's basically a call off. So you use this as and when you need us. Next slide, please. So you can see the poll questions have come up. Okay, we are holding ESOS Action Plan drop-in clinics on the 17th and 19th of December. So if you want to scan that QR code, you'll be able to book a slot that suits you. I think they're 15 or 20-minute clinics where you can talk about your own particular challenges and explore ways in which we might be able to help you. Next slide, please. I think we're just about out of time. We've answered some of the questions that have come up during the webinar, and we will try and get back to as many of you as we can in the next week or so. So it just leaves me to say thank you for your attendance, and I hope you found that informative, and thank you for all the panelists for their expert input. Hope to see you again at the next webinar.